Hey guys, this is episode 2 of the Webb Perspective. This episode is going to focus on the mystery surrounding the Mercator projection and the different issues around it. I'm joined today by my high school AP psychology teacher, Mr. Brett Mayfield. How about you tell us a little bit about yourself again?
Yeah, so Brett Mayfield, I've been teaching here at Madison Central for 11 years now. I teach now mostly AP psychology. I also have a class in AP human geography. I've taught global studies and future studies and history classes before, but I am really excited about our topic today. I've always been fascinated by maps, and even as a kid, just those road maps you get at the gas station on the side of the road, I'd get and safety pin them up to, the walls in my room and stuff, whatever. But I've always enjoyed maps, and I think it's fascinating how they're represented, and I'm excited about this conversation.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this too. Last year I was in my English class and my teacher gave us this article. And I was reading it and it was about how the Boston public school system has banned the Mercator projection. And I used the word ban correctly this time. It is no longer in use. As we talked about last week, ban is not always used appropriately. But it is in this case. It is no longer being used in favor for the Peter Gall's projection. My first reaction when reading this is I was kind of defensive, I guess, of the Mercator projection, simply because that's what I've grown up looking at. And
so now they abandoned the Mercator in favor of the Gall's, Peter?
Yes, they did.
Okay, all right.
They did. And I was came to the defense of it immediately. The Mercator projection I knew was in the 1500s. It turns out it's in 1569. And I was also aware, me being a big fan of the early adventurers of the world, that the Cape of Good Hope, which is the bottom of Africa, was not rounded until the early to mid 1600s. So my immediate thought was, I don't think there's a good reason to ban this. It was just the map isn't, because the argument was that the map was Eurocentric.
Sure.
So I thought, I don't think it's Eurocentric as necessarily as much as it is simply ignorant in a way. It just didn't know how to properly display the distance. That was until I started doing some more information into it. And after reading some information, I've completely changed my position on the map. So I'm just going to read a couple quotes from the assistant superintendent who spoke very heavily on this. This is Colin Rose speaking. So they changed, and the reason was he said this. This is the start of a 3-year effort to decolonize the curriculum in our public schools. When you continue to show images of places where people's heritage is rooted that is not accurate, that has an effect on students. And as we talked a lot about language on the last episode, can you speak to what the connotation and power of decolonize can have?
Wow, that use of decolonize certainly brings to mind the age of empiricism, the age of imperialism, where you had countries that were the European powers that were settling and taking over lands that already belonged to other people. It brings to mind abuse, stolen resources, cultures forever impacted by aggressive European expansion. So certainly that word brings to mind a deep historical background that I think adds some real light to this discussion.
I think it's important to note the school district that this projection is no longer in use in is 86% non-white.
Okay.
So it is a
so he's talking about the population of his school, that the areas that many of them would call their countries of origin, at least from their ancestors, would not necessarily be represented correctly on a world map.
So I read over this and I never really knew the exact distortions of the map. I heard because we live on a globe, it's round, you can't have a flat map that accurately represents us.
No. Whenever you take a 3-dimensional surface and you try to map it onto a 2-dimensional surface, what you're going to end up with is distortion in either direction or size or shape. And all maps are made with a purpose, and so it just kind of depends on what your purpose is, what part of or type of fidelity you're willing to give up in exchange for another.
So I was just going to, for the listeners, just to give you a bit of reference. For example, Greenland appears to be roughly the same size as Africa, when in fact Africa is 14 times as large as Greenland. And this is the fact that plays, I think, most into the use of the word decolonize, because I really do think that word is accurately used in this situation. This fact was Canada and Russia appeared to be 25% of Earth's landmass when they were actually 5%. So if you look on a Mercator projection, which is very popular, you'll see it in pretty much any public school,
Sure.
in private school for that matter. It appears Russia and Canada are massive, which they are large
Right.
countries, but
Well, I really kind of think we ought to, give a break to the Mercator map because I'm not saying we should use it for academic purposes because it doesn't serve academic purposes very well. But in terms of navigation, the one really good thing about a Mercator map is that it holds the lines of latitude consistent. Am I getting that right? I get latitude and longitude mixed up sometimes.
lattice flat.
Right, lattice flat. So it holds lines of latitude consistent, which makes navigation simpler. And so many maps you see that were used by ships, that are used by ships prior to GIS systems, would find it useful to have that type of map. But when you're talking about an academic setting, when you're trying to put historical events into context among countries and look at land features and those kinds of things, the lines of latitude being even is not such a useful feature. And so it's more important to look at resources and how close countries are relative to one another and natural features.
Yeah, the map created by, I'm probably going to pronounce them wrong, Gerardus Mercator, I believe is how it's pronounced, was made for colonial European trade routes. So it was actually made for the purpose to trade more, I say trade, to more effectively take advantage of the colonies the Europeans had in the Americas, was the original intent. So in essence, the word Eurocentric is actually very accurate because it was made for Europeans, and then it stayed in the schools. I mean, our school districts and system wasn't founded until a couple hundred years after this projection was made, and there were many more projections made since then. Before our school districts, and I'm talking about 1800s, before our school district was formed. But we chose to use the Mercator projection. I just find that interesting. Do you have any opinions on that?
Well, I think we prefer the things we're used to, and we don't like things that challenge our ideas. And in many cases, with the growth of the U.S. economy, our trade, both with Europe and with Asia, has been an important kind of cornerstone of how we relate to the world politically and economically. And so on many maps, you'll see a Mercator projection, but you'll see a shifting of view, not so much that Europe is at the center, but that the United States is at the center. And you're seeing, the Atlantic Ocean on one side, the Pacific Ocean on another. I think that speaks to, you almost want to say it could be the arrogance of our nation, but really it's a practical matter. But absolutely, if we're using those same maps that are meant to be used for trade, and we're using them to assess historical value, we're missing out on important relationships. And as you said, the distortions certainly impact how much we value a particular area. The idea that Greenland is so much bigger than Africa when we know it's not, that affects how much we value that. I was watching The Daily Show last night, and there was a guy on there, Hari Kondabolu, I hope I got his name right, but he wrote a book called The Problem with Apu, and he's talking about Apu from The Simpsons. And in discussing that, Trevor Noah made this statement that I thought really fit with what we're talking about today. He said, lack of representation fundamentally shapes how people see the world around them. And I think that's what we're seeing with the Mercator map is it doesn't accurately represent where people live, how nations interact, and so it's not good for educational or academic purposes. I think the school district is doing the right thing. I don't think they're saying Mercator's bad. I think they're saying Mercator is not good for the purpose.
I don't think Gerardus Mercator would expect his map to be in use in an American public school.
No, I think every cartographer understands that maps are made for particular purposes, and when they are no longer useful for those purposes, then we move on.
So I love reading different articles because there's different perspectives from every news source you read. So I found this one interesting quotation I'll read out for you by The Guardian, and I found it a tinge bit dramatic. Correct me if I'm wrong here. When Boston Public Schools introduced a new standard map of the world this week, some young students felt their jaws drop. In an instant, their view of the world had changed.
I think that's true. I mean, it's most students at that age haven't traveled the world. They haven't seen different cultures, different places, different land features. We are talking about them shifting. They're changing this imaginary space of what the world looks like. And it's pretty dramatic. I think many of our listeners probably may not have a good picture of what the world is really like. And if they, get on Google and look around a little bit for different projections, they may find that Europe is much smaller and much higher on the globe than they think it is, and so is the U.S. And that Africa is a much more interesting place than the desert many people picture it as.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just one of those random facts of how wrong the projection is. I believe it's America would be completely encompassed by the Sahara Desert, actually.
Absolutely.
It's one of the facts. So this issue of the Mercator projection, while it was new to me, introduced to me earlier in this year, has actually been around quite a while. It's been around. It's a relative term.
Just a couple centuries.
But, for example, in popular media, it has been displayed more than I realized. There was an episode of The West Wing, which is was a very popular show in the mid-2000s, that talks about this exact same issue. And maybe through your experience, you've seen more, this issue brought up more in the news than perhaps someone my age.
Well, I have seen that episode of The West Wing, actually. It's one of my favorite clips. And I think in that clip, you have C.J. Craig, the communications director, is talking about, she's talking to a group called the Cartographers for Social Justice or something like that. Really interesting group, and they're talking about the impact of maps. And she's having the reaction that you're talking about kids having, in that they showed her a variety of projections, and she's just saying, wait a minute, have we been living in that place the whole time? There are several newer projections that are more useful, and they are projections that compromise. They're compromise maps that have compromised on whether they're going to show fidelity of shape or of size, and they do the best they can with each without distorting each too much. But you also have the Robinson, which is more accurate. You have the National Geographic map that's a little more accurate. And then you have maps like the MacArthur map. I think I'm remembering the right label for this. But the MacArthur map is the one in which we take our traditional map and we turn it on its head. And we view south as north and north as south. And that's wrong, or it feels wrong to us. And yet there is no up and down in space.
It's true.
And so that map is as accurate as any other map. I remember staring at that the first time I ever saw that on the West Wing, and then I Googled it and looked at a more clear picture of that map and thought, how strange that is where we live. It's just like that. That both are valid maps, valid projections.
The more I researched this, I definitely came to the conclusion that the Mercator is very, very wrong and is not the best tool to use for teaching. But I also thought, I don't know anyone who still uses paper maps for navigational purposes, and B, I don't think becoming a sailor, especially an international sailor, is a big occupation that a lot of students in America are going towards. So,
no, not really.
So my question was, what is the purpose necessarily, for practical reasons, for changing to a different projection? Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed. To hear the rest of the conversation, tune in next time. This has been the Webb Perspective.